Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our 7th live office hour for the MOOC on environmental security and sustaining peace. I'm Carl Brook. I direct international programs at ELI. And I apologize in advance. I'm at an airport, so if you hear some announcements, there may be some distractions. We will try to manage those as we go along. I'm here with Silja Halle. Silja is a guest lecturer for the course. She's also a program officer with UN Environment's Post-Conflict and Disaster Management branch. She's the program manager of the joint UN Environment, UNDP, UN Women, and PBSO program on promoting gender-responsive approaches to natural resource management for peace building. We'll hear more about that in a moment. Silja joined the Post-Conflict and Disaster Management branch in 2006 and has held several roles within the branch, including as Deputy Sub-Program Coordinator for Disasters and Conflicts. Prior to joining the branch, Silja worked for the Geneva Environment Network, a cooperative partnership of environment and sustainable development organizations in Geneva, Switzerland. She holds a Bachelor's and Master's of Arts degrees in Humanities from the University of Geneva. Silja, welcome. I wonder, before we dive into some of the questions, if you might be able to tell us a little bit more about the program on promoting gender-responsive approaches to natural resource management for peace building.
Sure. Thank you, Carl. Thank you all for having me and for listening to the lecture on gender natural resources in peace. So I have the great pleasure and honor of coordinating a joint program with 3 other UN organizations, UNDP and the Peace Building Support Office, which focuses on looking at ways in which natural resource interventions, whether interventions around environmental governance or interventions around natural resource conflict mediation or other interventions around economic recovery, for example, how these natural resource-based interventions can support greater participation of women in both the peace process itself, as well as the post-conflict peace building and development process. So we are looking at testing different strategies and approaches in the field. We currently have 2 pilot projects, one in Sudan, where we're working in communities that are heavily affected by climate change to see whether we can support greater participation of women, not only in developing alternative livelihoods for these that take, but also greater participation in managing some of the conflicts that are arising around the degrading natural resource base. Our second project is in Colombia, where we're looking to support the government, and in particular local governments in Chocó and Antioquia departments, on implementing the territorial planning process, which is part of the peace building process, and looking at ways of increasing women's participation in that process. So the program is really a kind of a learning exercise. We're looking at getting good practices from the field and then further disseminating those through training and other tools to support better programming in this area in the future.
Wonderful. I'm wondering how far into the project are you, and have you started to see lessons learned or approaches coming back?
Well, we're not quite far enough to talk about full lessons learned yet or impacts. The program started about a year ago, so our first pilot is going to wrap up a little bit later this year, and the second one, the one in Colombia, has just started this January. So we're quite early into the process, but we have learned a number of lessons already as to how to engage with women and women's groups and local authorities in demonstrating the need for these kinds of interventions and the potential benefits from those. Surprisingly, we found that it was slightly easier than we expected originally. We thought we would encounter more resistance, particularly in environments such as Sudan. We found that actually by making the right arguments, local authorities are really quite receptive, much more receptive than we expected them to be. We've also found that we've also learned a number of lessons in terms of engaging with local partners and local women's networks and associations, and really leveraging their knowledge and expertise and intimate understanding of situations on the ground. So we have some of these initial lessons coming through that are helping us build stronger pilot projects, but not necessarily anything we could describe yet as an impact.
You mentioned that when you phrase the questions right, or when you talk to them in a particular way, that they're more receptive. What are the sorts of arguments or points that you raise that make people more receptive to considering the role of women or empowering them?
Well, just to give you an example, for example, in Sudan, we're working in a region called North Kordofan, which, as I mentioned, is heavily impacted by climate change and by the degrading environmental impacts of climate change. And one of those impacts is causing out-migration of men. So many of the traditional livelihoods, such as tending to acacia plantations, which produce gum arabic, which is an important livelihood for that region. Many of those plantations are heavily degraded and no longer producing sufficiently to sustain communities. So many of these communities are seeing greater and greater numbers of men migrating not only seasonally, but increasingly annually. And therefore, it's the women who are left on the ground to tend to not only these plantations, but of course to other forms of livelihood, such as horticulture or plot agriculture. So many of the elders in the communities that we've been working with actually readily recognize that their communities are increasingly female, that they're increasingly dependent on female-headed households, and they're increasingly, as a result, receptive to the kinds of targeted support that we're looking to bring to women in those areas, because they understand that those women are not only supporting their own families, but their communities as a whole. So similarly, they are increasingly recognizing the roles that women can play in terms of conflict resolution and in terms of reaching across communities and indeed different even ethnic formations or groups to discuss on a different basis with those opposing groups on some of the issues that they're having in terms of sharing resources and in terms of conflicts over resources such as land and water. So I think we're tapping into a real recognition that is already there on the ground, but helping these communities understand how better to support these women, heads of household, and these groups of women that are already formed.
A student is asking, what mechanisms should we adopt to get women involved in decision-making processes or engaging in up-level of natural resource management when the government doesn't allow NGOs to freely participate in large-scale decision-making meetings or otherwise limit their activities? That the student says this is in the context of a less democratic country. Any thoughts on that?
Well, obviously, having a freely participative processes is a much easier context. I mean, I would say the difficulties that we would have in getting women involved in decision-making processes are quite similar to the kinds of difficulties we would have when civil society organizations or civil society representatives as a whole are not allowed to freely participate in decision-making processes. That obviously makes the situation much more difficult. But I think the strength of an identity like gender or being a woman, etc., is that it does transcend these other kinds of formations, and that there are typically, even in these countries, a number of women in government, for example, that can be used to sort of leverage greater participation or greater recognition of the role that women can play in decision-making processes. There are different kinds of associations of women. It's not necessarily all NGOs or CSOs, etc. There are many women involved in anything from trade organizations to faith-based organizations and different kinds of formations that perhaps governments would be likely to engage with more readily. But it's for sure. I mean, it makes the situation much more difficult. I don't know if you want to, Carl, jump in on that as well, and perhaps based on your experience, introduce a few more ideas on that. challenge. So I don't know. I mean, obviously that.
Sorry, having the background noise here. It seems like the other thing that I would say about this is that it also depends on the context. That people are often able to participate in women or communities are often more able to participate in decisions that directly affect their livelihoods, their public health, where large money is involved, like with extractives. That's a lot harder.
Yes.
And so there might be windows of opportunity where you can cultivate participation and then expand from that space into other spheres or other higher level opportunities.
Yes, indeed. No, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that what I understand from the student's question is linked quite closely to the kinds of processes that are related to extractive projects, for example, where, you know, if government doesn't plan or doesn't allow for any kind of participatory decision-making process around that, it's I think more difficult to argue that women have a specific role to play as opposed to the community as a whole or something like that. But indeed, there are multiple other areas or sectors in which that's much easier. Health being one of them, of course.
So I'm curious, again, I apologize for the background noise. One of the students was asking, when we talk about empowering women, what does that mean in detail? And is it different in different countries, or does it depend on the context?
Well, everything is context specific, both in peace building and in development. So indeed, it would depend on the context. But I think we talk about two different, typically in the international community, two different forms of empowerment. Political empowerment, which is about ensuring women's participation in decision making at all levels. So in local level, but also national level governments, and in any number of other governance processes, whether related to natural resources or to any number of other topics. And the second form of empowerment that's frequently discussed is economic empowerment, and that is ensuring that women have the ability to participate freely and at the same level as men in the local and national economy. So whether that is through jobs, whether that is through production, whether that is through you know, any number of other forms of economic participation. So those are the two main forms of empowerment we discuss. They're both important in relation to peace building. Political participation is obviously linked to women's participation in peacemaking itself, and participation in, you know, mediation and conflict resolution processes, agreements, etc. But also in the post-conflict peace building process, in terms of redefining national or, you know, local values, in terms of redefining means of government, in terms of redefining any number of I mean, all of the elements that need to be defined around governance. Economic empowerment is extremely important for women in post-conflict contexts, in order to ensure that they contribute to economic recovery and that they benefit equally from economic recovery after a conflict or, you know, during a peace building process. That is often not the case. We actually find that women tend to or can often benefit in some ways economically from a crisis or from a conflict. Women, for example, have been known to sort of shift some of their traditional roles and to sometimes take up new economic roles that are typically reserved for men or traditionally reserved for men. And these shifts are very important to maintain, at least, you know, in some form in the post-conflict process. We often find that post-conflict processes in economic terms tend to benefit men much more greatly, and that a lot of these gains that women experience or can experience during a crisis are not sustained in the post-conflict period. So anyway, it's a long answer to the question of empowerment, but just to summarize again, we talk about political and economic empowerment, and both of these are crucial for peace building processes, and both present opportunities from an environmental peace building point of view.
It strikes me that there are also kind of specific tools or categories of tools, like the rights and reforming laws to allow women to own property or to hold mining licenses, things like that, or quotas, where it's not a legal right, but it's more of a project right, requiring a certain number of women to requiring that a certain number of seats be set aside for women, whether it's in negotiating peace agreements or in developing projects. And I guess the other two things that struck me as tools or categories of tools, one was creating spaces that women feel that they can participate, where it might not, due to cultural norms, having men and women mixed, sometimes women are reluctant to speak. And so having them in different rooms for part of it to provide a safe space seems like another approach. And I guess the final one was capacity building, both training and then access to credit or some of those things that enable women to participate.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with all of those. And these are some of the approaches that we are hoping to test through our joint program. Currently, through our program in Sudan, we are, for example, looking at ways of increasing women's economic empowerment by providing them, with training, with inputs and access to market around some of the crops that they produce, and increasing their yields and so forth. So that would be a type of sort of economic empowerment intervention. Whereas in building on that and on the sort of legitimacy that they gain from those interventions, we're looking at strengthening their participation in sort of conflict resolution mechanisms. So increasing their sort of technical understanding of some of the issues that come up in these fora around natural resource sharing, those types of things. So that would be something, more related to political participation. But again, all of those sort of tools or strategies that you've named are all absolutely correct, and they're all part of the range of interventions that one could have around women and natural resources in these contexts.
A student asks about the importance of choosing the voice of women in post-conflict contexts and from which side they should be represented. I think this is it's easy to take this question a little more broadly and say, not all women are the same. And so how, if you talk about empowering women or having women representatives, how do you decide who those people are, those individuals?
That's an excellent question, and indeed, I think this is one of the mantras that we repeat most often. That sort of woman does not mean much in and of itself as a category. Women is one identity, but it's always intersected with any number of other identities, whether ethnic, national, economic, and all of these other things often play a more significant role for the individual than the fact of being a man or a woman. So indeed, that's a difficult question. And how do you understand, or how do you choose who gets to represent the fact of being a woman in these processes? I think we have direct experience now through our two projects of having to select different participants and ensuring that we have a balanced mix of women from different backgrounds who represent sort of different constituencies, if you will. And on occasion that is challenging. I'm thinking, for example, of our project in Colombia. So one of the ways of doing this is obviously working through local associations and local partners who have a much better understanding of who, you know, the different groups are and who needs to be represented and who the constituencies are, etc. So in one of our projects, we have an excellent partner that is actually a federation of women's groups and associations already formed. But we're finding, for example, that particular federation, although it represents a really wide range of women, including Indigenous women, Afro-Colombian women, it does not recognize, for sort of historical reasons and for reasons that are linked to very real grievances, it does not recognize, for example, FARC women, or women who are, you know, representatives of the FARC, who are now demobilizing and trying to reintegrate with society. And so we're having a challenging time bringing all of those factions together. As the UN, we have a fairly unique convening power in trying to work with these groups and help them sort of come together in a single process. But it can definitely be challenging. I would say the number one advice or guidance on that is really to work through local partners. Well, maybe one, to take the time needed to really understand who the different groups are, what the different relationships are, what the levels of influence are, and then to work through local partners to identify key participants and ensure that there's a balanced representation, but also understanding that these local partners come from a specific place and they have a specific perspective that may need to be countered at a certain point. But it's an important question, and I'm glad we had a chance to discuss it.
I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about how conflict affects governance during and after conflict, and how that in turn, particularly how that affects women in gender relations. You had alluded to changing economic roles. I'm wondering if there are also changing political or legal or governance roles that happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a conflict context, I think one of the first things that comes to mind is insecurity. And unfortunately, women and girls are significantly more at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. And this relates quite directly to their natural resource management roles. I think most of us have seen images of women carrying out sort of daily tasks such as collecting water or collecting, you know, wood for energy and being at risk of attacks. And of course, the lack of, you know, police presence or the lack of any form of law enforcement massively increases the rates at which this happens. So that's one very direct impact. Another one is I would say just lack of the risks related to the lack of enforcement of different rights that women have, either sort of legally, formally, or customarily, in terms of access and usage rights to land. So women's, you know, and land, as we all know, underpins sort of usage rights to all the other resources. So women often have often risk sort of losing access or having their access impaired when there's no or other form of enforcement framework linked to the governance vacuum. So I would say those are probably the two most important impacts of weak governance. But many discriminations that women face, unfortunately, are not necessarily linked or not exclusively linked to weak governance, but there are structural issues and discriminations that are there anyway, but then are further reinforced or further, let's say, worsened by the lack or weaker governance in enforcement.
It seems like another thing is the opportunities that during conflict and in the immediate aftermath, often governance is weakened, and that so there's international attention to strengthening governance, and in that process of strengthening governance, there is a chance to address some of the gender inequities.
There certainly is, and that's what I was referring to earlier in the need for targeted attention on these issues and better understanding of how conflict may have affected women's roles, women and men's roles, and may have shifted some of those roles. There is an opportunity to reinforce some of the positive shifts that may have happened during a conflict period, but there's also a risk of ignoring those, and which can lead to rollbacks. So one of the areas that our program is trying to highlight is specifically these shifts that occur during the conflict period that provide women with potentially more opportunities at the political or at the economic level, and how to support those throughout the peace building process and ensure that they become institutionalized, of course, in a way that doesn't is not necessarily detrimental to men or to other groups, but is mutually reinforcing. So absolutely, there are some positive impacts, but they tend to be short-lived if they're not if attention is not paid to them specifically in the post-conflict period.
And so, in terms of making the arguments for, say, let's focus on property rights and the land grabbing that you were talking about. What are the most effective ways of addressing that? And how do you convince decision makers that they should, lawmakers, that they should give women equal rights to property, or that they should enforce what's on the books, which may be there but not enforced?
Well, I mean, if you're speaking from a benefits point of, I mean, there are two maybe sides of the coin, or potential answers to that. I mean, there's the basic argument of rights and human rights in particular, and the basic principle of gender equality, and you can appeal to governments or to decision makers to enforce that as a framework. Most of these countries have signed up in one way or another to some of the basic principles of human rights, and you can appeal to that side. We tend to do that, of course, but also to reinforce the idea of the kind of win-win, or the benefits of targeting or supporting greater participation of women, whether economically or politically, or enforcing their rights. And starting with the fact that there's a direct correlation between women's economic empowerment and the security of women's rights, for example, to land, etc., and the health and general well-being of communities, not only women's families, but communities as a whole. And so you can appeal as well to that side of the sort of general benefits of well-being, but also very direct economic benefits of focusing more directly on women. If you talk about sort of participation of women in peace agreements, for example, there are very strong numbers now coming out showing the impact of including women more systematically and more substantively in the mediation or the resolution of conflicts and in the negotiation of peace agreements. I think I quote the number in my lecture, but peace agreements are shown now to be significantly more sustainable when there's greater participation of women. So there are a number of these basic arguments that can be made that are perhaps more appealing than some of the rights-based arguments, at least to some decision makers, and in some countries and in some situations. And we have tried in our report that came out in late 2013, which I think is still one of the only sort of general overview studies of the linkages between gender, natural resources, and peace. We have tried to sort of lay out systematically what some of the benefits are, not only to women, but to communities and countries as a whole.
You mentioned the statistic on involving women in peace negotiations. Why do you think the peace is more durable, more stable when women are involved?
Well, I mean, from a basic point of view, I think when processes where women are more strongly involved or involved in greater numbers are, generally speaking, better processes, full stop. They are processes where attention has been paid to inclusiveness, to representation of different constituencies, where efforts have been made to ensure that different points of view are represented and heard. So that's one very basic point, is that women benefit from, generally speaking, from a process that is better designed in that way, and therefore associated with better outcomes. But I do think one of the areas that has been shown to be quite radically different when women are involved is, well, there are two elements that are put forward. One is that women tend to bring together or bring with them better community buy-in of a specific process. So women tend to be better connected to their own communities as representatives and able to sort of bring the community along in the process. So stronger community buy-in is one of the areas. And the second one is that women have been shown to, through their interests and priorities, pay more attention to root causes and be more interested in getting to the bottom of what some of the grievances are and how to solve some of these really thorny issues. That interests us particularly with respect to natural resources, because of course natural resources are often one of the drivers or root causes of conflict. And this is one of the areas that we're trying to look at through our joint program, is using that specific entry point of women's interest or women's tendency to prioritize issues around natural resources and access to natural resources and benefit sharing from natural resources, specifically to further strengthen their participation in peace processes. But I would think those are some of the core elements. I would encourage students to read a recent study on this, on women's roles in peace building processes that came out last year by IPI, and cites some very interesting research by the University of Geneva here, actually, on trying to quantify the impacts of women's participation in peace building processes. It has some really interesting elements.
And maybe we can post that in the discussion forum.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
The student just asked the question, what do you think about quotas for women's participation in different organizations or in the parliament, for example?
I think there are risks and opportunities linked to quotas. I think the risks, which are very often cited, perhaps too quickly, is that having quotas is not sufficient in and of itself, and quotas tend to lead to very symbolic participation. So there are many examples of governments, organizations of all kinds, where a large number of positions, or at least some positions, have been sort of reserved for or mandated for women, and that what you end up having, or what ends up happening, is that women do indeed fill those positions, but only very symbolically. The women sitting in those positions doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. That they tend to be very marginalized or silent, or not sufficiently capacitated to participate very effectively or substantively. So there's a whole current of thinking that quotas are not useful because they don't necessarily lead to a more stronger or more substantive engagement from women. I think, on the contrary, there is a lot of evidence showing that quotas can be very effective as a transitional measure. And just one example that comes from Rwanda, which is quite famous by now, where in the peace building process or post-conflict process in Rwanda, the government mandated, for example, that 40% of all sort of seats or positions in the commissions that were in charge of land reform in Rwanda be reserved for women, and also reserved a number of seats or positions for women in sort of local authorities. And that really has led to a very significant increase of women, not only in sort of governance mechanisms, but very concrete and direct impacts on women's land tenure, and more general, more equal tenure over land. So I think there are a lot of examples in the specific area of sort of natural resource management that demonstrate that at least as a transitional measure, quotas can be quite effective and lead to pretty significant incomes in quite a short amount of time. But Rwanda is also a very, Rwanda, I think, has the most, the parliament, national parliament with the greatest number of women, etc. So I think this, the effectiveness of this actually exceeds by far the natural resource sectors alone. But it's a strong example demonstrating that these can be quite effective.
There's another example like that from DRC with local management over water. So it's very interesting to see the data start to build on this. I'm wondering if you might be willing to shift a little out of your comfort zone. One of the students asks, next to women, there seems to be another large group that tends to be primarily perceived as victims of the conflict rather than empowered as a crucial actor in the peace-building process, namely youth. Could you please elaborate a bit on the opportunities and challenges of involving youth in post-conflict processes? What kind of initiatives are planned or already in place from the side of the different UN agencies, and what kind of tools can be used to strengthen the position of youth in these settings? I'm particularly thinking of the MENA region here, the student says. And if you want, I can jump in here, but I'm wondering, with your expertise on gender, how, to what extent do these approaches apply to the context of youth? To what extent are there different issues, different considerations, or different approaches that might apply?
I'm happy to venture at least a few elements of an answer here, and hand it over to you, Carl, if you have elements to add. I'm not a youth expert by any description, and there are many people who are. So I would encourage you also to look into some of the existing programs. I think there's great recognition, at least in the UN system, that engaging with youth is absolutely critical in terms of post-conflict peace building, and I think there's ever greater attention being paid to this in relation to counterterrorism efforts. At least that's where I'm seeing it come most strongly, and the UN system really does recognize the importance of engaging with youth across the board. I mean, I'm just thinking, for example, the Peace Building Fund has a specific funding window, as they call it. Let's say, a funding mechanism for projects that relate to youth. So there's a great recognition of that within the UN system. I would think, in large part, in terms of inclusion and better processes, more participatory processes, etc. Many of the approaches that we are discussing might be similar, and perhaps useful in this context. I'm actually thinking of some of the differences in terms of engaging with women. I think one of them relates simply to age and the ability of engaging youth in governance processes. I mean, typically, whether it's government jobs or roles in government, whether even at the local level, but of course then at the regional and national level, there aren't, youth or young people. I suppose it depends how you define youth, but typically young people are not necessarily engaged in those processes by virtue of being very young. Similarly, there are fewer, I suppose, youth involved in the types of organizations that we would be involved with in the types of projects that we manage. So, trade associations or the kinds of groups that we would tend to interact with in order to to partner on a specific activity. So I would think actually some of these issues are perhaps more complicated in this and not directly are not directly applicable in the sense of well, simply applying the same strategies and approaches, whether employment or sort of political participation. Maybe Carl, you want to? I'll try to think of a few other things if you have a few elements to add to that, and I can come back.
I think that it strikes me that there are two dimensions here that you highlighted that are really important. One is the livelihood side, and for both women and youth, there's often an emphasis on how can we value their time, how can we empower them, how can we give them rights. In some cases, you have, like in Sierra Leone, one of the grievances that fed the conflict was the inability of many youth to access land. So trying to figure out how to give them economic opportunities. The other is on the governance side, empowering both youth and women to participate in decisions that affect them, that affect their families, that affect their futures. And I think that there are differences, but it seems like in both cases there's a lot of commonality in terms of not giving them full respect of the adult males in society, and so it seems like there are a lot of opportunities, but I am not a youth expert either. But it seems like those two dimensions, that the livelihood side and the governance side, seem to be primary areas that need where there's priority on attention.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think on the livelihood side, definitely there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, I know of a project in Sudan as well that is focusing very specifically on a combination of educational support and developing alternative livelihood programs for youth that are at risk of being dragged into conflict situations on the border with South Sudan, for example. So I think there are a number of examples related to livelihoods that are probably very helpful and in some ways similar to the work we would be doing on gender, but with maybe a more direct focus on sort of training and education. I also know of specific efforts to involve youth as a group in peace agreement negotiations, or at least conflict resolution around issues related to natural resources. So I think those are some of the entry points. I would on political participation, I think, as you mentioned, and as I was trying to articulate before, I think it's some of the mechanisms by which we do that are sort of by definition reserved for adults, and therefore a little bit more complicated. But again, I'm sure a youth expert could give you a much better, a much more complete answer as to how the two would be related. And I think it also depends entirely on how you define youth and up to what age. It's a very different thing if we're talking about people up to 25 or 30, or more directly children. And I would think the issues are separate there as well.
I wonder if we could come back to the Rwanda land reform process that you mentioned. Do you have any insights into how Rwanda came to have that 40% quota, and whether there was any consideration of Hutu or Tutsi composition of the women, or did they tend to be from one group or another?
I'm afraid I really don't. I don't have at hand the origins of that. I can only assume that it is, that the decision was made as part of a much broader effort by government to ensure or to improve gender equality outcomes across the country and in a number of areas. I mean, this is far from being the only example of specific attention or specific measures being taken to ensure greater or improvement of gender equality outcomes and women's empowerment more generally. And as I mentioned, although I don't know if it's still the most the parliament in which women are most heavily represented, it certainly is still very, very up there in terms of having large numbers of women represented in parliament. So I would assume that it's part of a larger effort and larger or more basic principles of governance being adopted by post-conflict Rwanda. As to the efforts of distribution of these positions on these commissions and distribution of these roles across different ethnic communities, I don't have those numbers at hand. I would be happy to look into it again and post any sort of bibliography related to this on the discussion feed as well.
That would be wonderful. I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about land and agriculture. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about artisanal mining. And some sectors, some countries have a lot of women in artisanal mining. Do you see any differences in women's roles in artisanal mining? And if so, then what can be done to equalize those the opportunities for women?
Differences between men and women, or
between men and women? So I think Hayes and Perks, for example, mentions that in the DRC that women tend to have less lower paying jobs in artisanal mining, that they don't necessarily have the same rights, or that they might be processing and carrying, but they're not owning their little plot, or they're not getting the full benefits.
Yeah, I mean there are very large numbers of women involved in artisanal mining globally, much greater than one would think. I think a third of all artisanal miners are women, and they have a very wide-ranging number of roles across the sector. Some are miners themselves. Many are involved at different stages of the processing, and many are involved as traders, including cross-border traders of the materials that are mined, bringing them back and forth, etc. So there's lots of different roles, and typically women are very much disadvantaged as compared to men, whether that's a question of owning or having access to the area that is mined. Typically women have much less rights, even if they're not sort of legal rights, but customary sort of rights to accessing that specific plot of land. Typically, or very often, it's done through the ownership or the access rights of a male relative or husband or spouse. And generally their status, even in this very informal field of in artisanal mining, is very precarious and highly vulnerable to all kinds of sort of shifts and changes that can happen. It's very variable by country. And of course, women in artisanal mining, as in industrial mining, are heavily involved as well as in the whole sort of service industry that develops around mines and mining. So whether that's providing food, providing other types of services, there's a high level of prostitution around many artisanal mines, as there is around industrial mines, etc. So women tend to have, I mean, this is obviously a gross generalization, but typically the lowest paying, least secure, most vulnerable to all kinds of shifts and changes jobs in industrial mining that there are.
And so I guess the following question, that's setting up the problem and the need. What are a couple of the basic solutions? For example, as you note, a lot of the artisanal miners, they don't have legal rights to the mines. It's more customary and claims. So that if the country looks to formalize artisanal mining, it could be explicitly protecting men or legally. What are other opportunities?
Well, through formalization, obviously, codifying the rights to access land and rights to access land, and ensuring that those are equitable, and that women have the same rights as men to access their own specific areas. There are a number of interventions that can be that can happen throughout the sort of value chain related to women. So whether it's supporting women's access to market, whether it's increasing or developing women's sort of technical capacity around specific forms of mining, whether it's capacity building for any number of specific tasks that they might be involved in or might benefit from training on. Generally, I would say it's just sort of specific attention paid to not only, or let's say, recognizing that women have strong levels of involvement in artisanal mining, and then ensuring that they have equitable outcomes from that involvement. We haven't worked specifically on artisanal mining through our projects, but there are a number of organizations that have, and there are really interesting projects, including pilot projects around supporting women along the value chain and looking at improving their access to market, which I could also post specific references to. I think they're excellent examples that, although they're context specific, of course, can also help sort of shape potential interventions around these issues in other countries.
Could you say a little bit more about the women's role along the value chain?
Sure. So as I mentioned, women have different roles in the whole sector. So there are women who are involved in mining specifically, so digging or very often panning, for example, in rivers and riverbeds. There are women who are involved in breaking apart the raw material and extracting the ore that is, or whatever it is that is mined. There are women who are involved in washing these various components that are then sort of taken to market. There are women involved in transporting and then selling and trading to middlemen usually, or other people along the value chain. There's women involved in trading the materials that are mined cross-border, very often illegally and in very vulnerable and precarious conditions. So there are women all along that chain. What you don't find very often are women in the sort of the formal value chain, sort of going upwards from the production and washing and sort of transport to market process. At that point, very often women's involvement kind of stops, and you have much greater numbers of men involved in bringing these things to market, and then along the various points at which they are traded upwards and exported.
Why do you think that is?
The same reasons, most likely, that women are not very present in a number of other technical or I suppose not technical, but in other sectors. Lack of access to education, lack of access to specific forms of support that men typically have access to, lack of cultural or social support or understanding for women in these kinds of roles, lack of opportunity more generally for women, lack of consideration for their skill set, and any number of sort of these basic structural issues that plague women in many different sectors. There are a number of sectors where one finds virtually no women or very few, including a number in the natural resource sectors, whether extractives or agriculture, for example. The differences in women's agricultural and involvement, to come back to agriculture, are also very, very striking. You find great numbers of women, much greater numbers than men, involved in sort of plot agriculture, or very, very local sort of forms of agriculture, food production, etc. But much, much fewer women involved in sort of the production of crops that go to export, and typically therefore make a lot more or generate a lot more income. So you find these differences across a number of other sectors where women tend to be heavily involved in some of the very local, basic, immediate jobs, and then disappear up the value chain, so to speak, once you get to more income generating forms of production or forms of employment.
We are coming up on time. I'm wondering, I'd like if you could talk a little bit about how development aid addresses gender. Where has development aid, bilateral and multilateral, been particularly good on addressing gender, natural resources, and peace, and where is there need for further action?
Well, you qualified your question. So you started out by asking about development aid more generally, and I can answer that, where development aid has been good in terms of gender, sensitivity or support for gender, because it's important to say that there have been some very significant progress in support to women in sectors such as health, but also education. You see very, very strong support being provided by donors and the international community through the international system for those sectors, for example, where there's a lot of targeted, very specifically targeted support to women and gender equality more specifically. When it comes to gender, natural resources, and peace, however, support has been up to now either simply non-existent or very weak. I think there are two reasons for that. One is that generally speaking, if you look at the numbers, or if you look at development aid more generally through the numbers that are produced annually by the OECD, the weakest general aid sector for women, or for support for gender equality and women's empowerment, is what they call the productive sectors, and those sectors include, agriculture, for example, which is a huge area of where women are strongly involved and could benefit from support. But many other economic sectors, the whole finance and banking system, etc. So that the support to women and gender equality is very low, generally speaking, in the productive sectors, and that the level of support for those sectors is even lower in what the OECD calls fragile states, but more generally conflict-affected states. So from that perspective, there's been very little support. On the other area where support has or continues to be provided in the wake of Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, there has been a lot of attention and a huge amount of support, and very deservedly so, towards sexual and gender-based violence and conflict, and protection of women, but much less in terms of women's participation, and obviously even less when it comes to identifying and capitalizing on the opportunities that natural resources represent as an entry point for women's participation. So I would say that really on the specific nexus of gender, natural resources, and peace, there's been very little support provided through development aid for all of these reasons, but there are many different sort of sectors and areas where significant progress is being seen and continues to improve.
Excellent. Well, I don't know if you have any final words for people who are watching.
Well, simply thank you for giving me the opportunity to have this office hour, and to say that I'm very happy to take further questions or to exchange with students through the discussion feed. I've posted, I think, once or twice, but I will do so again with the follow-up materials I've promised. And please, encouraging everyone to get in touch for further exchanges on this one particular area, or more generally on women, natural resources, and peace.
And I want to encourage everyone to tune in next week to the 8th office hour, where we will have the core faculty all together talking about how to further engage in environmental peace building. Thank you all.